Canada's Idle No More movement gathers momentum at the country's First Nations groups being targeted by Stephen Harper's government. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. It began as a small social media campaign armed with little more than a hashtag and a cause. But Canada's Idle No More has grown into a large indigenous movement with protests and ceremonial gatherings held almost daily in many of the country's major cities. Well, Idle No More is spearheaded by Teresa Spence, the leader of the Attawapiskat, a small native band in northern Ontario. Spence is now 22 days into a hunger strike on Ottawa's Victoria Island, just across from the Canadian Parliament. Well, Spence and other First Nations groups are demanding better living conditions for Canada's Aboriginals. And they're angry at the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, which they accuse of trying to erode their land and sovereignty rights. Daniel Lack has more.
In swirling snow late last month, they converged on Canada's Parliament in what became the largest gathering so far in the Idle No More movement. That began in early October with just 4 Aboriginal women and a Twitter hashtag, and it's grown into nationwide protests, like this flash mob in Toronto that brought thousands to a city centre intersection. More than anything else, a hunger strike by Chief Teresa Spence of Northern Ontario's Attawapiskat community has galvanized Idle No More. Now into her 4th week, the chief is demanding meetings with Prime Minister Stephen Harper and a representative of the British Crown, which negotiated treaties with Aboriginal people when Canada was a British colony. Chief Spence rose to prominence in 2011 when Attawapiskat faced a food and housing crisis in the icy depths of a northern winter, prompting international media attention and a Red Cross rescue effort. She and her fellow protesters want an end to the often squalid housing conditions in Canadian First Nations communities. But more than that, they want autonomy and respect from Canadian governments that they say have neglected them for decades. For Inside Story, Daniel Lack, Al Jazeera.
Joining me to discuss Idle No More and Canadian First Nations rights are in the studio Pamela Palmater. She's a lawyer and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University in Toronto. And from Ottawa, Clayton Thomas Mueller, an Indigenous rights activist and Tar Sands campaign co-director at the Indigenous Environmental Network. And we must point out that we did invite several Conservative Canadian MPs to join the panel. All declined. Well, Pamela, I want to start with you. Let's talk about the movement. What is it that sparked it? What is it that Idle No More is looking to achieve?
Well, when you think about it, the movement's really been in play for a long time. I mean, the conditions of First Nations people have been deplorable for a long time, the use of our lands and resources without our consent. But the kind of spark was this legislative initiative by the Harper government, which started with Bill C-45, but also includes 14 other pieces of legislation that's being imposed on First Nations people without, some of it, without their knowledge and consent. But Bill C-45 is unique in that it's a large omnibus bill and it impacts both Canadians and First Nations in terms of protections for Navigable Waters Act and unilateral amendments to the Indian Act. And so what you had was an imminent threat, something that we couldn't put off for negotiations for 25 years. It was a piece of legislation that was being rushed through the House without any input or consultation. So we had no choice but to gather very quickly and react.
And let's look at some of the sort of grievances that have been put out there by the Idle No More movement. First Nations groups say Bill C-45, as you point out, is just the latest bid by Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government to change laws protecting the rights of Canada's Indigenous people. Its changes affect all Canadians, as you pointed out there, not just First Nations. C-45 amends laws that govern waterways and environmental protection. Canada's government says the changes are necessary to clear up what they call red tape and protect the economy. But First Nations protesters say their lands, their treaty rights, and sovereignty are being eroded. They say they were never consulted under C-45 when it was under consideration, and that is a violation of Canadian law. And they also point out that Harper's government has repeatedly supported limits on First Nations authority, despite promising not to approve any changes to the Indian Act. Clayton, I want to bring you in here. I mean, how does this sort of infringe on land rights that have been set out and protected for so long under the Canadian Constitution?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Canada is currently being governed by a very extremist power in the form of Prime Minister Harper and his cabinet. The reality of Bill C-45 and the complete gutting of 30 years of environmental approvals, enforcement, and regulatory mechanisms significantly kick open the door for international investment in tar sands and other unsustainable and harmful and devastating extractive industries, which disproportionately impact our native people and our way of life. Because when these industries come into our territories and destroy our water quality, our air quality, our ability to hunt, fish, and trap, all of which are constitutionally enshrined and protected rights, this has significant effect on our land base. And, we see it in the tar sands in northern Alberta. We see it with the encroachment of mining companies all across Canada.
So you're saying this is an issue of getting to the natural resources, that it's a distribution of wealth this government doesn't like and is trying to recoup? Is that what you're saying?
This legislative agenda of Prime Minister Harper is all about kicking the door open for Canada to become a place of business, resource colony, if you will, to superpowers like the United States, like China. This is one of the reasons why Harper is trying to negotiate all of these bilateral free trade agreements. It's all about a free market economic agenda and turning Canada into a resource colony for military superpowers across the planet. And the reality of it is that First Nations peoples and northern communities are on the front lines of this economic agenda and its devastating impacts.
And Pamela, I guess Chief Spence, Teresa Spence, has basically said enough is enough. Is that where we are right now, in that we've got the hunger strike going on and she's saying, I've got to stop this?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at it, Idle No More started before Chief Teresa Spence's hunger strike. Her hunger strike started after the chiefs protested on Parliament. And what she's saying, she's not asking for anything unreasonable. What she's saying is, listen, we have no running water, no sanitation, we have deplorable housing, if any at all, lack of education, lack of unemployment. Over the last 20 years, all of the socioeconomic indicators for First Nations have gotten progressively worse, markedly worse in the last 10 years, and it's not coincidental that we have a conservative government. And what she's saying is that's not what the treaty relationship envisioned. The treaty relationship, although the treaties are different across the country, boil down to this agreement to share the wealth, to share the lands and resources, that we would all live in prosperity. And so far, only Canada has lived in prosperity. And not only have we not shared in that prosperity, but like Clayton said, we've received all of the negative impacts. So we have the polluted rivers, the contaminated reserve lands, the lack of food, and all of those things that go along with aggressive resource development that's done in a non-sustainable way. And I find it very interesting that he said what he was trying to do with the legislation is get rid of the red tape, because what he's actually trying to do is circumvent his legal duty to consult, accommodate, and get consent of First Nations people on all of these things that he's doing, because he knows First Nations, Aboriginal and treaty rights, which are constitutionally protected, is the last best defense that all Canadians have to protect these lands and resources.
Well, let's hear from Chief Teresa Spence, because she certainly addresses this and has been very vocal. Native groups asked Stephen Harper repeatedly to meet with them to discuss their problems with C-45, and here's what their spokeswoman, Chief Spence, had to say.
It's time for everybody to work together. That means the government too. And to treat us with respect and honor. Even that treaty, that was the purpose of that treaty, is to go in peace and honor each other and respect each other and fly together with the future, not to go separate ways. And this is what's been happening with the government. He's not listening or honoring our leadership. So that was the purpose of that treaty, to be partners. But the way it is right now, we feel like we're more like a slave to the minister, not a partner.
So Clayton, if First Nations people feel they aren't being consulted on this, and these are changes that are going to impact not just First Nations, but also all Canadians, why isn't there more public consultation going on?
Well, again, we're living in a time where Canada is being governed by a extremist right-wing conservative government. You have to compare Harper and his cabinet to Bush and Cheney, only worse. The amount of legislation and laws and legal protections that they have stripped away with 2 omnibus bills in the last, half a year is 30 years worth of legislation. And I think that for us, we are basically rising up to put a stop to this agenda as First Nations peoples. It's important to understand that when you look at a map of Canada and you look at all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities in this vast landscape, and then you overlay a map of all of the most toxic and harmful and unsustainable industries, oil and gas, forestry, mega mining, hydroelectric mega dams. They are all within 20 or 30 kilometers of our home communities. And environmental racism is very much a daily reality that Indigenous peoples in Canada are facing. And this government's agenda is all about continuing to suppress Indigenous rights, to try and devolve their federal fiduciary obligations defined by the treaties, defined by our God-given inherent rights as the first people of this land, to provincial governments. And the reality of it is, I think, that people need to understand is that Canada is very much an apartheid state. It continues to be.
Okay, well, again, we should remind our viewers that we did invite the Harper government, or a spokesperson from the Harper government, to come on and defend some of these accusations. They declined that opportunity, but they have said in various newspaper articles in Canada as well as outside of Canada that this is really about a broken system, a relationship between First Nations people and the government of Canada, which has not been working for so long, and that this will modernize sort of that relationship. And when it comes to environmental issues, we'll sort of eliminate the red tape that has existed for decades and eliminate a lot of the bureaucracy that exists when it comes specifically to some of those natural resource issues.
If only that was the case. Think about the funding that's appropriated by Parliament for First Nations. You have some $9 billion a year. Over a third goes to sustain Indian Affairs' ever-growing bureaucracy. They add more and more employees every year, making 6-figure salaries, vacations, professional development. Their kids get to go to great schools and drink clean water, and ours don't. There's something wrong with that picture. And when you think about all of this legislation, we're not just talking about environmental protections. When they say we want to modernize the relationship, don't forget the Prime Minister at the Crown First Nation gathering almost a year ago now promised First Nations that, to be certain, our government has no grand scheme to unilaterally repeal or amend the Indian Act. And what has he done? He's introduced 14 pieces of legislation that some of them are just like the Dawes Act here in the United States. It's meant to break up communities so that there'll be no longer reserve lands, no longer any special recognition.
But are the reserve lands working? I mean, you can't ignore a lot of the statistics which show there's a tremendous problem with poverty, with substance abuse. Clearly, something's not working and needs to be addressed. Isn't some effort better than none? Clayton?
I think that when you take a look at the correlation between harmful extractive industries, the destruction and desecration of sacred sites, of fresh water, access to clean water, access to food security, and the introduction of these types of industries into traditional Indigenous territories in Canada, you can directly see how how Harper's policies are really aimed at continuing to perpetuate this ongoing dysfunctional relationship. You have to understand that, again, it all goes back to the economic agenda. 29% of Canada's wealth is based on the Aboriginal suffrage industry, whether it's, taking care of the health epidemic issues, incarceration, you name it. And all of that, again, is directly related to the fact that this government is doing everything that they can to suppress our rights, to not honor the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which they did endorse rather cryptically, I will say.
Well, let's hear from this government, because we do have a statement from them, although they wouldn't appear on camera. None of the Conservative MPs were willing to appear on Inside Story Americas, but we did receive a statement from John Duncan. Now, he is the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. Here's what he had to say. The Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary have made repeated efforts to reach Chief Spence to engage in discussion on the issues she's raising. We will continue to try and engage the Chief and other First Nations leaders to discuss how we can build on the progress that we have made since 2006. I point out that the government has built over 30 new schools, renovated more than 200 schools, built over 10,000 homes, renovated thousands more, invested in safe drinking water systems, increasing funding for child and family services by 25%, and introduced legislation to protect the rights of women on reserves, settling 80 outstanding land claims, investing in over 700 projects that link Aboriginals to job training and counseling services. We believe that working together is the best way to build on this progress. Pam, the government says that they're doing their job. They're reaching out and working with the community.
Well, I think that's a very important point, because Idle No More wouldn't exist if they were doing their job. And what is their job? Look at the stated mandate on INAC's website. It says they have one mandate, and that's to improve the social and economic well-being of First Nations in this country. And over the last 20 years, it's gotten progressively worse. And what is the fundamental reasons for all of this stuff? We're not talking about financial mismanagement. We're talking about purposeful chronic underfunding that has been a very specific policy agenda of the government since the earliest colonial days, because they only ever had one objective, and that was to get rid of the quote-unquote Indian problem. They've never changed that policy objective, and if you look at all of the things that they cited, they have been countered by their own Auditor General on all of those things. So when they say, we increased funding for water on reserve, they didn't. They allocated it for water, but they spent it somewhere else. When they said they increased funding for child and family services, why are we at the Canadian Human Rights Commission suing them for discrimination because of the chronic underfunding of child and family services? So on every single point they raise, they don't even give you the facts. We can't even have a fact-based conversation.
Well, Clayton, let's talk about some of these environmental impacts that could also be part of the changes that are coming into play. I mean, how is this going to affect the First Nations community when it comes to a lot of the sort of traditional hunting and fishing rights and resources that the community has counted on for generations?
Well, before Bill C-45 was passed, there were 2.6 million lakes, rivers, streams, and shorelines on Canada's 3 oceans that were protected under the Navigable Waters Act. Today, post passage of Bill C-45, there are 87 lakes, streams, and coastal areas that are protected now under federal legislation, most of them being in the ridings of key conservative players in Harper's government. The reality of it is that Canada has kicked open the door to private sector oil companies like Exxon, like Shell, BP, to the mining sector to come in and ravage our most precious resource, our water. And when we look at the fundamental connection that Indigenous peoples have to the sacredness of Mother Earth, and particularly our First Nations women who are leading the Idle No More movement, I'm honored to share this panel with Dr. Pam Palmater and to speak, in support of Chief Teresa Spence and the young women who started the social media campaign with the hashtag Idle No More, because of the fact that, our most sacred and precious resource, that water, is something, of course, that our First Nations women hold, within themselves to create life. And I think that is fundamentally what is at stake here with the agenda of this government, this economic agenda, is the sacredness of our lands is under threat. and our people are getting sick as a result of it. When we look to the tar sands and the cancer rates in communities like Fort Chipewyan, where you have over 100 people that have died from cancer and other autoimmune deficiencies in just 10 years, and this is a community of 1,200, you know, if that Athabasca River that flows through the tar sands flowed south through Edmonton and Calgary instead of north to the Arctic Ocean, there would be tens, if not hundreds, of square blocks of dead or dying citizens in those cities. But because it's a small, sleepy native village in the north affected by the tar sands with the same story in 100 other communities that are beside toxic industries, you know, and because it's native people who are getting sick from these industries, you know, it's swept under the rug by this government. And so we have to understand that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, and Idle No More is really the coming together of a lot of little fires into one large fire that is going to redefine the relationship between Native people and non-Native folks in Canada from here on.
Pamela, right now we have Chief Spence continuing this hunger strike.
Yeah.
Her health is deteriorating. She still has not gotten the meeting that she's looking for with the Prime Minister, although the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, John Duncan, has expressed concern for her health and has encouraged her to stop this. I mean, where is this headed?
Well, think about it. John Duncan offers a media release saying he's tried so many times to contact her. He contacts her at the band office. He tries to contact her by fax, by letter. She's in a teepee on Victoria Island. Everyone in the world now knows where she is. Everyone in the world has gone to go visit her. It's like saying, well, I want to talk to my son, and I'm going to send him a text and an email and a letter and smoke signals, but not actually just go to his room and talk to him.
So if neither side is talking, what happens here?
Well, what happens is this Idle No More movement, see, Chief Teresa Spence is not alone. This Idle No More movement and the action on the ground by First Nations activists like Clayton and First Nations leaders, this is all working in tandem. So if Canada doesn't come to the table soon, you're going to see a coordinated national effort in very short order because of Teresa Spence's weakening condition that will make them reconsider just how important we are in this country and just how many Canadians will stand beside us, because this impacts Canadians and Americans.
But is the hunger strike the way to achieve those goals?
Well, she's also doing a sacred fast, don't forget. This is part of our culture and tradition, and it's one of the ways to highlight the issue, because keep in mind what a hunger strike is. For every day that Chief Teresa Spence doesn't eat, she's slowly dying. That represents what's happening to First Nations in this country every day. We have up to 20 years less of a lifespan because of the purposeful chronic underfunding, the environmental contamination, and the theft of our lands and resources. So what she's doing symbolizes what's happening to First Nations, and if there's one way to speak to Canadians, maybe it's that way.
Clayton, is this a relationship that can be turned around, that can be repaired, the First Nations relationship with the Government of Canada? Because by all appearances right now, it seems broken.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think that I would reframe the question. I don't think that the relationship between, you know, First Nations and the Harper government is going to go anywhere. You know, this movement is part of a global social movement that is taking a look at the neo-liberal free market economic agenda of governments like the current Canadian government and saying we want another world, you know, with catastrophic climate change, with issues of the loss of natural capital to sustain our ridiculous economic system, the end of the era of cheap energy. You know, the world sees the correlation between these types of neoconservative policies and this never-ending war for energy that has been going on for the last generation. And I think that what is happening here in Canada, being led by First Nations women with the support of our warrior societies, of our elected officials, of everyday citizens on the street, Native and non-Native, we are living in a time of reconciliation. And whether or not this government is on our side of history or going to stay on their side, they're going to get left in the dust by what is the emergence of the world's largest and most powerful social movement. And I know that the viewers all across the globe watching Al Jazeera know what I'm talking about, you know, and they want that same world as well.
20 seconds left. Is this a moment of hope? Is this a turning point?
It is, because I believe in the power of our peoples. The fact that we all came together with no politicians, no money, no organization, this just came from the true spirit of our people, and that's what'll sustain it, because we're all related. We're all nations here connected and tied to this land. It's a part of who we are. So I have no doubt that this change is coming and they can't stop it.
Pam Pumiter and Clayton Thomas Mueller, we appreciate you talking and lending your viewpoints. Thank you. That is all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Thanks for watching Inside Story Americas.